So welcome, good morning to this session on supporting and assessing reflection or reflective practice. We've got a lot to pack in, so I'll crack on and hopefully I have planned to have plenty of opportunity for Q&A or some opportunity for Q&A at the end. So hopefully we can get there. So the purpose of today's session is sort of, as it suggests in the title, is to explore strategies for you to support your trainees with reflection and reflective thinking and reflective writing, and also identify how you can assess reflection for the observational training activities, so the OTAs. I do strongly recommend you either attend or view the webinar once it's taken place on Thursday that I'm doing with trainees, as I'll go into more detail with them about actual reflective thinking and reflective writing. But because we're focusing today on you supporting and assessing those reflections, we will touch on some of what I will cover with the trainees, but we won't go into the same level of detail. So you might find it really useful to have a look at the recording of that if you can't attend on Thursday. So OTAs then, the observational training activities. Obviously, it's really important for you to be familiar with the work-based assessment standards. And I can see that people have obviously looked at those because they said about the 2 time points, etc. And really, the purpose of these training activities, so the OTAs, are for your trainees to be able to develop an understanding of practice in general terms, particularly as an introductory part to the department and the role of a healthcare scientist. And it provides them with that sort of awareness of the wider context in which they're going to work and how that might impact on their own practice as well. So the purpose of the evidence that they're looking at, and today we're just looking at reflective practice as evidence, is that it's got to show that they understand, they're beginning to understand practice, and it might have expanded, so increased their understanding. It might have challenged what their preconceptions about practice or what they were anticipating to see, or it might have reaffirmed it, so actually reinforced what they understood already as what that perspective of practice. So these are really important points to bear in mind when we're looking forward. And reflection itself actually provides the means to do that in depth, rather than just sort of being able to say, well, I saw this, I saw that, and I now understand that this is the role of a consultant in X. It's more about, because some of those activities, just regurgitating what they've seen isn't necessarily shown that they've understood it and learned from it. So in terms of reflective practice, sometimes some misconceptions are that it's all just about how you feel about something. And actually, yes, although feelings can come into it, the definitive part of it, whatever sort of definition you look at, is about having an experience and learning from it. So, and reflection allows for that taking a step back in order to learn and critically analyse what's been observed or what's been experienced. So it should contribute to improve practice, and it's about getting that greater insight into the learning. So part of that I've introduced here, and I do explain this to trainees as well, that so Moon, for example, Jenny Moon, she identified 5 stages of learning. And so, you've got the surface learning and you've got the deeper learning. And at stage 3 there on those stages is sort of the pinnacle point where we move from that surface learning to deeper understanding and deeper learning. So noticing is something that a trainee might do for, as their primary thing to begin with. So when they're trying to go through this sort of learning journey, if you like, they might notice a topic or event or experience as being interesting or important in some way. And that's where they might address their feelings about it. But then stage 2 is starting to make sense of it. So they start to take a step back. They start to try and understand what they've observed better. And then stage 3 is starting to make that meaning. So they start to make connections with things at this point. They start to maybe question things and even ask those questions to try and connect those ideas together. Stage 4 is where they're starting to work with meaning. So they make links with other ideas and events there. And they might, this is where reflection is really starting at this working with meaning. And then the transformative learning is where they formulated new ideas or new understanding about something, and they're starting to think about how it might actually influence their own practice or their future, what actions they're going to take from the learning that they've uncovered. So that's just something to bear in mind in terms of why we reflect. And then there's this 4-dimensional approach to reflection. So we know someone mentioned about knowing whether there are 2 different time points in terms of how they can reflect. And these are 4 different time points that they could actually consider. And so we could have reflect before action, in action, on action, and beyond action. So the reflect before action can sometimes be referred to as pre-reflection, and it links in very much with that those stages of learning, particularly the noticing one that Moon identified. So the trainees recognizing that they've got to plan for this. So in general terms, if it was something that they've had some experience of before, they might actually recognize that it's something that's familiar to them. And they know that how to think about how they're going to approach that situation before they even enter it. But we'll come to how that links to the OTA shortly. So I'm just going to talk about these in general terms. So reflect before action is if you're someone experienced like yourself, you might, let's say you are undertaking a clinic, if you're patient facing in that way, and you've done this many a times before, so you know what you're about to embark on. And so you think about it, almost subconsciously about what you're about to enter into, and you prepare yourself for that. Reflecting action is what happens during the event. So this is where it links in with the making sense element of Moon's different types of learning. And it's the decisions you make during an event or an experience, and how you might adjust what you're doing to best handle that situation in front of you. So it's quite dynamic. So if using the analogy again of entering into a clinic, you might already have experience of that. So you mentally prepare for that, which is that reflect before action. But reflect in action, if you had a patient and they display behaviours that were unexpected, then it's the decision making that you make within that situation to respond to that patient that is that reflecting action. You're drawing on other experiences that you've had before in order to respond appropriately. And then reflect on action is what we tend to think of about reflection, is when you're making that step back after the event. So you're reflecting on the action that you've already taken. and you consider what happened and what you can learn from it and how it will influence your future practice. So it leads to you implementing new ideas or experimenting with new learning. And it links very much with that making meaning, excuse me, and working with meaning that Moon mentioned in her different types of learning. And obviously, a lot of the models for reflection are used as a tool for that reflect on action as well. And just to say about models, no one's prescribing what model that any trainee should use at all. Some models suit some situations better than others, but it's down to personal choice a lot of the time. And I'll come to that shortly. And that reflect on action can be when things go wrong, but it can also, more just as importantly, is about when things go well, and understanding why things go well can help us, in our future practice as well, to employ those techniques, and it also can help with that reflecting action also. And then the final one is reflect beyond action. So that's links very much with the transformative learning that Moon identifies. And it's very much linked to lifelong learning. So it's not about treating experiences as isolated incidences. So it's about revisiting experiences or an event in order to gain new learning from it. So after some experience, you might reflect back again from something that happened 6 months before and think, well, actually, when I look back at that, I see it from a very different point of view now because of some of the experiences that I've had since. And something that's very common in health professions now, and in social care as well, is using professional storytelling to enhance learning. And what we mean by that is where professionals share individual experiences with each other and they reflect and analyze it together. And that shows that, that helps improve it by gaining different perspectives from other people. But it's also, it can help look at things in a new light and gain new learning from it. And also sharing those experiences can bring people together too, in terms of they recognise that some of these things are things that they feel apprehensive about or feel not equipped to deal with can actually be something that's common, and it can lead to greater learning for everyone. It can be cyclical as well, these different time points, because, for example, if you engaged in reflect before action, you will be using your prior knowledge from when potentially you reflected on action in order to inform your next experiences. So if you think of a job interview, if you've had many job interviews over your lifetime, we don't just forget about what that experience was like. And when we go into it, maybe, a few years later, we move on and apply for other jobs or whatever. We actually draw on our prior experience to actually mentally prepare for going into that new job interview, because we've had that experience before. So it's something that, human beings do. We don't just forget that learning that we've had prior. So linking this all to the OTAs, I've got some suggestions there, basically. So before action, it would be very much what the trainee will do to plan for that experience. So, for example, they'll notice what is expected of them, and that will involve discussing it with yourself, so their training officer or assessor, and using the considerations part of the curriculum to actually aid that discussion as well, to recognise what is expected of them in there. It's also about identifying how they feel about embarking on that experience as well, so that training activity, and what they anticipate they'll learn from it. So they might have some preconceived ideas about the role of the consultant or what it's like to run a clinic, Or they might have a lot of questions, and that's where they can record those questions in advance of what they, identify as what they want to get out of that experience. And do they anticipate any barriers to embarking on that experience, whether it's an observation of a clinic or shadowing another professional? And they can identify those. So it starts getting them to think about the experience before they embark on it, so that they recognise that they're not just there to passively observe this experience, that they're actually got to have this active, be actively involved in seeking this experience out, seeking the information out, and engaging with the opportunity. And there's all sorts of questions they can ask themselves at that point. So, do they need clarification from anyone beforehand of certain things? Is there what opportunities do you think, do they think there's going to be to ensure that they're successful in actually fulfilling the intended outcomes? And what actions they need to do before the experience in order for it to be successful for them. And then we've got the inaction part. So that's about decision making during the event. So they might actually observe that in somebody. So they might observe if they're shadowing a consultant or if they're attending a clinic. They might actually observe their subject, if you like, making that moment-to-moment decision making during that event. But it could be the trainee themselves demonstrates that in the way that they're observing. So they might change their focus as something unexpected happens and that they observe, and it piques their interest. Or, like we've said, that they observe it in the colleague or the person that they're observing. And they themselves might have their own preconceptions challenged when they're observing the subject, if you like, or having the experience. And they might reflect during the experience on what is going on around them as well, and record down how they feel about it at that point. So if they're observing somebody in a clinic and the patient gets upset during that clinic, the trainee might jot down their own feelings about the situation, particularly if they think, that it's something that they're worried about or concerned about for their own practice in the future. And it is important for the trainee to take notes, if possible, during that reflection in action, and jot down how they feel at different points during that experience. And they can make notes of things there that they want clarification of later. Sorry, I went forward there. And then we've got the on action. So we know on action happens after the event. So this is where they're going to do, this stepping back, and it might be immediately or the next day or very soon after the event. They're going to analyse the experience, but they might draw on, if they've already done some reflect in action, they might revisit that reflect in action and how it made them feel at the time, and whether they've changed their perspective on that now they've taken a step back. If they did some reflection before action, they might draw on that, revisit that as well and say, actually, I was really challenged here because I had this preconception about what I was going into, and actually it surprised me what I observed. I didn't expect it to be what it was like, what I actually observed. So, that's where they can draw those two different time points together. And of course, as part of that reflect on action, they're going to come up with some sort of potentially some short-term actions that they might take as well. So that might be that they might want to observe somebody else, or they want to attend another MDT meeting to get a different flavour and look at something slightly different from a different perspective. So, there's lots of scope there with the on action about taking a step back after the event, analyse what they observed or what they experienced, and what learning they'll take from it, and what actions they're going to take to move forward. And then finally is the beyond action, and that too can be used when reflecting for the OTAs as a different time point. As we've said, it's about evaluating and re-evaluating, looking back to progress forward. So it might be that your trainee engages with other trainees to share stories of experiences, and then that might transform their view of the experience. So if you've got two trainees and they both attended, it might be the same MDT or different MDTs, let's say, MDT meetings, then they can share those experiences and then reflect again in light of that conversation that they're having with somebody else. Or another way of doing that is they revisit their reflections on the experience. So here, when they come to do their observed assessment, so their OCEs, OCEs, DOPs and CBDs, and they can say, right, I've done lots of different training activities that I've reflected on that will prepare me for my DOPS, OCEs and CBDs. I've undertaken a DOPS, and then they might reflect on that following, and bring it all together. So bringing all the reflections that they did on the training activities to actually help them prepare for that DOPS and do a reflection after that as well. And it can inform their professional practice further then, so when engaging with the specialist modules and beyond the programme. But if we're just looking at it in relation to the OTAs, they can do it based on those assessments, which is what I've put here. So this comes straight from the work-based assessment standards. So we know that those completing those training activities for a module, they have to then showcase those skills and knowledge in the in-person work-based assessments. So if they use their reflections to actually support them in preparing for those, they've hit another time point to support them. So just as a summary with that then, the guidance says they've got to reflect at 2 points in time. So they might do before, and then they might do soon after. So they might plan for the experience and identify what they're hoping to get out of it. And then they reflect after and mention if these thoughts at the beginning were actually challenged following the activity. They might do soon after the event and then a week later, or they might do soon after the event and then revisit the event later on following the assessments that they've done, such as the OCEs, CPDs, etc. They might even reflect on the module as a whole, so at the end of the module, when they've completed the reflections at one point in time, they might do a collective reflection and to say, this is what I've got out of this module and this is my overall learning from it. Structure, like I said, any model, they can use any model they like. I just use in this one the what so, what now, what one, because I think it illustrates really well what we need to focus on with the trainees in terms of when it comes to reflective writing, and particularly with the OTAs. So it's very much whatever model they choose, the key components of it is there'll be some kind of description of what they've observed, the event or experience. There will be a review of it, so an element of analysing it to identify what the learning is from it, what they've got out of it. And then there'll be an element of what action they're going to take in order to stimulate that knowledge into their own practice. So I've set that out. So in terms of reflection, The description is going to be the shortest part of that. It's just about setting the scene. It'll be a summary of key points of the experience and only include the most significant information. So it's not a blow by blow account. They did this, then they did that. You know, it's not a police witness statement either. And it's certainly not an essay. So it needs to be selective, because this is not where the learning occurs, but it does lay the foundation of it. Obviously, it's the experience. Where the learning comes in is in the next two. So the review and the impact and action that it's going to take. So under the review, they might explain why they felt the action or event was significant in some way. So what elements they felt were significant and why. This is where they might explore how they felt about the experience. But the key thing is them answering what they've learned from it. Were there any surprises? What did they feel was good or bad about it? How does it link to what their preconceived ideas were about that, you know, what they were walking into? Have they had any prior knowledge or experience of something like it before? So you might have a mix of trainees, some that are in service that have had some prior knowledge as well. Did it conflict with what they were expecting before they went into the situation? Was there anything significant? Does it help them gain any insight into their own practice? You know, in preparation for the assessments, will it help them with that? Do they feel? So, you know, they can start to look at whether it's expanded, challenged, or reaffirmed their perspective of practice, which is what it identifies as the purpose of the OTAs in the assessment standards. So this is where the deeper learning is starting to occur. And then, excuse me, we've got the impact and action. So what are they going to do with that new learning now? And some of that, you know, they might put an action plan together. They might identify some next steps, what they want to do. And that could, you know, one of those steps might be to go and observe another consultant or go and sit in another MDT meeting and focus on something slightly different that piqued their interest in the first one. They might identify here how it will support them in moving forward for their assessments, what they're going to take from it in order to support them with their module end assessments. And it's about reinforcing learning and making it meaningful there, because there's no point having an experience if you don't learn from it. And there's no point identifying the learning from it if you're not going to show how that's going to impact on your own practice and that you're going to take steps to reinforce the learning. Ways that you can support your trainee is plan. So it's discussing the training activity with them in advance, obviously using the considerations part of the curriculum to do that, to help guide them, although that's very generic and it's not a checklist, it's just there as a guide. But you can support them to contextualize that, definitely. The learning outcomes also help to contextualize as well, but also identifying that they can't physically reflect on absolutely everything as part of that experience. So it's about them being selective. And encourage the trainee to reflect before the event as well, like we said. Promotion, a lot of you have mentioned about promoting reflection and reflective practice. So involving them in team discussions and conversations at team meetings and so on. They can observe people being reflective dynamically in that way as well. I've put the 4-dimensional approach there, so encourage them to reflect at different time points and encourage them to identify pertinent moments that they've observed as well. And then engage a role model. You've all mentioned that. So having those reflective conversations with your trainee to encourage that reflective thinking, engage in self-reflection yourself and actually share your learning about your own practice with the trainee. And it could even be around your role as a trainer. So if you're quite new to being the training officer, let's say, you might share some of your own reflections that you've had or engaged with too. And also encourage the trainee to engage in reflective conversations with other people as well. So that might be peers or other trainees on the STP that might be in different phases of their training. So it gives them different perspectives as well. Focus on the learning, that's really important. So merely just explaining what happened isn't enough, and they can get bogged down by, there's so much to see, that focusing on some of the key things can actually gain a huge, they can gain more in-depth perspective on what they're observing. And finally, I've got coaching. So a lot of you have mentioned in your responses, basically, you've demonstrated that you're using some coaching skills there to actually support your trainee in thinking for learning. So what I mean by coaching for reflection, and this is something you can actually find, it's a push-pull continuum that you might have seen before. There's a coaching module in the Learning Hub in our catalogue of resources for training officers. And I use this to explain, the different sort of coaching techniques. So one end, you've got mentoring. So the push side is more of a mentor where you tell, give advice, give feedback, make suggestions. And then you've got the other end, which is more pull, which is non-directive, and that's more of a more coaching technique. So you'll probably use a mixture of both here. So giving feedback, a lot of you mentioned, but then asking questions that raise awareness are more on the pull, and some of you mentioned those, which was fantastic. But you might make suggestions as well on how they can improve things or look at it in a slightly different way. So you can use a combination of these, definitely. So there's no right or wrong with this at all, but a lot of you are going towards that coaching, which actually encourages more and more self-reflection, which is really positive as well. But early on in their reflective practice journey, if you like, you might give, they might rely a little bit more on this to begin with. And then as they get more and more confident with reflection, when you're asking them questions that probe a deeper understanding, they engage more fully with that. And it leads to you enabling them to and support them to be more reflective as well. So that's something that you could look at separately, but I think a lot of you have mentioned those skills already, which is really, really positive to see. And just revisiting using the 4-dimensional approach, I've just put this image in for a simple reason that it's been adapted by Edwards, which you can find the full reference for this in the Learning Hub because I've put that in there as well. I've actually uploaded the article, I think. If not, I will do. But this image just illustrates that interconnectivity between those different dimensions, really, different time points. Because if they're reflecting before action, when they come to reflect on action, they'll draw back to that. And so that reflect before and reflect in actually influences how they reflect on and beyond that action as well. So it enables them to take a step back and view things in a different perspective also. So that's just something to illustrate how they can connect together. So the next bit then is assessing reflections. And before I do, I just wanted to bring up, and again, this is something I've put together and it is as a PDF at the moment in the Learning Hub. I will upload it to here again shortly. I did it at the beginning, but obviously you can't all see it if you joined afterwards. So I can just copy that. Let's see if it'll let me do it. I'll do it in a minute. So what I've done, some of you mentioned about having some different questions to actually probe encourage your trainee to be more reflective. And I've produced this little guide on each of the different dimensions and what questions the trainee can ask themselves, but obviously you can use it to support you as well, to actually support them in reflecting at those different time points. So reflect before action, we've got a set of questions there, just 3 questions with a few like bullet points for them to support their reflect before action. Same with reflect in action. Reflect on action, we've got some there as well. What did you notice? How has this contributed to your understanding of practice, and what will you take from the experience moving forward? Is just really simple. And then reflect beyond as well. And so that helps contextualize that a little bit better, because I recognize there's a lot to take in with those that I'm talking through. And I thought this would be a really useful resource to reflect back on, if you like, for you to have a look at and to support you and your trainee to actually navigate those different time points as well. So I will share that in the chat shortly, but it is available on the Learning Hub as well as a PDF. So I'm just going to reiterate this. So this is, let's say this is our cycle for reflecting. We've got description of what happened, a review of it, and impact and actions. And the emphasis is always going to be on those. And actually, if the review's done well, as someone had mentioned, it's about having that evidence base. The review will probably demonstrate that evidence base more than the description itself. So the description might just be very general, say, you know, I observed an MDT meeting, which that on X, there was a number of professions there, including, you know, obviously anonymizing it. And then the learning is, so, you know, I observed them behaving professionally, and this is what I learned from it about, you know, engaging with this type of meeting, except I'm doing this off the top of my head, as you can see. This is where the focus comes, rather than just a large narrative of this happened, then that happened, and then this happened. We'll have a look at a few examples shortly as well. So all of you have come up with this already, so you barely need me to talk about it in any depth. But the focus should always be on the learning, and this demonstration of almost like a growth mindset in your trainee, that they're looking to grow and looking to develop their learning, they develop this curiosity and this curious approach to their own training and the experiences they're being immersed in. Evidence, so not only evidence of undertaking the activity, but evidencing their reflections, which is really important, and contextualizing by providing examples as well when it comes to the learning. Self-awareness, so very much about what you've already mentioned, some of you. It's when the trainees reflect on other people's practice, assess whether they've considered their own feelings and try to understand the perspective of others from what they've observed, but also what influence their observing will have on the sort of healthcare scientists they aspire to be themselves. And then it's the depth, so the depth of the reflections as well. So it's not unusual at all. And in fact, I would say it's very common that those early reflections, if they're really new to reflective practice, those early reflections are going to lack depth potentially, and that's not a problem at all. That can be part of the feedback, part of the learning as well, and they might just be hitting that surface learning to begin with, and you might have a conversation with them about that. You might ask them some probing questions to satisfy yourself and them that they've learnt from it and you've identified the learning with them, but maybe suggest next time they take a further step back in order to assess what's going on. So that can be part of the feedback. And as time goes on, you would expect that not just for the OTAs, but beyond, when they're starting to do their specialist modules, etc., that regular reflections will still take place, and that they will develop even more depth. And especially, they might look back at their time of their OTAs and actually reassess what their experience of those once they start to get more experience as a healthcare scientist as well. And finally, actions. So you would when you're assessing reflections, you're looking for the actions that they're going to take or they're planning to take in order to assimilate the learning that they took from the experience. Which brings me on to format, because right at the beginning, when I asked what your experience was and what some of the barriers you felt or challenges there were, it was about, some of it came across as format as well of those reflections. And originally I called the webinar that I'm going to do on Thursday with the trainees I called it Writing Reflectively for OTAs, or for Observational Training Activities. And actually I reframed it in the end and called it Thinking Reflectively. So I reflected and changed the title, because actually writing reflectively suggests that it has to be written down, and it has been identified that recording your reflections in some way does have a benefit, because it allows somebody to it allows that individual to revisit those and thus engage in that sort of reflect beyond action, so they can revisit those further in the future and say, actually, how has my attitude towards that situation changed over time? Now I've got a better understanding of that role. But it doesn't mean it needs to be written. So it could be that it could be recorded. So if they want a recording of it, or you want them to record it, then they can verbally record it. They can have a conversation with themselves about what they saw and what the learning is from it. So if audio files and video files can be uploaded to one file, so if they want to use it as evidence and they want it recorded in that way, then they can. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if they don't necessarily have to have a verbal record of it, it could be that they have a verbal discussion with yourself or an assessor. And it would be fine in that format for you to sign it off. And in their one file, you put a statement to say it was discussed, and that you're happy to sign off that they've recognised, that they've done, they've achieved that training activity. Or you might use a combination of the two. So you might have a verbal discussion about the experience, so they identify what they got out of it, and then they do a written reflection after, or a recorded reflection afterwards, where they've actually not just reflecting on the experience that they had, but also reflecting on the conversation that they've had with you about that experience. Because actually you could say that they've then reflected in 2 time points. They've done their initial reflection and then taken a step back and reflected on the whole experience, including the reflection that they shared with you verbally. So if you like, that you are the training officer, or you are the one entrusted to make that judgment, and how your trainee does it, particularly for these OTAs, is flexible, but it needs to be agreed between the two of you. Someone mentioned about having a trainee who was neurodivergent and they find writing difficult. If they're happy to, they can do a verbal video diary if it makes, we don't want barriers put into place that will affect whether they can engage with reflective thinking and reflective practice. So if there are ways that you can do it with, that supports the trainee and able to ultimately demonstrate their learning from that experience, then you have permission to do that, if you like, for want of a better phrase. So basically, in summary, in terms of what I've put there, now I don't expect you to be able to see this in full as it is, but this is something that I will put on the Learning Hub, and I'm going to share this with trainees as well. So it's a map of reflection for the OTAs, basically. So it kind of goes through each of the aspects that we've talked about in terms of the process, if you like, of reflection for the OTAs. So it's obviously identifying what the purpose of it is, and that's that observational training activity. Got the description, so summary of key aspects of that experience. Any additional evidence that they might include there, and that might just be supporting documents or Q&A answers to questions that they've asked there. So supporting documents might be, obviously redacted and anonymised evidence related to MDTs. It might be an agenda, or whatever the experience is going to be. They might have some additional evidence there. But the important part is this reflection, and how, at different time points, as we've said, and then other processes that they might get involved in. So any actions they identify for their own development, engaging in professional discussions with yourself or peers or colleagues. And obviously the product that is a result is the actions or recommendations on how they're going to assimilate that learning into their own practice. And they might identify an area which warrants further exploration. So if they do, there's going to be more reflection. If they don't, there comes a conclusion to that process. And then it starts again. So if there's something else that they feel that warrants, they might want to attend another MDT or attend another clinic with someone else leading the clinic, etc. It gives them another perspective. So that's just something for you to take away, and I can send you a copy of that as well, along with the questions. Before we finish, what I did want to just show you is that we have got other resources available. So obviously I've mentioned the NHS Learning Hub ones, and there's a wealth of resources on there for other things. Got the webinar on Thursday for trainees, but also there's some sharing good practice things on our catalogue on our website. And one of the really, really useful ones is one from Danielle, who's a training officer, and how they've developed a novel approach to reflection and assessment for the first year rotations. It's a short presentation, 10 minutes long. Have a look at it, and it could be really insightful for different ways of approaching delivering the rotations. Okay, so I hope you find it really useful. It is really difficult when where I can't see people and talk to people directly. It's the first time we've done it like this, so if you've got any suggestions that you want to give me on improving it or developing it differently, please let me know. But I am developing some more resources on the Learning Hub to support you following this, really. So thank you very much. And if you've got any reflections that you'd like to share in the future that we could redact, then that would be really useful too. And that's it from me.